Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar from Real Story Group on the future of agency relationships. As I'm sure many of you are experiencing firsthand, AI changing operating models and evolving customer expectations are reshaping the way that enterprises work with external partners and really creating some important new questions around ownership and strategy and long-term value. But we're really excited today to have Tony Byrne and Scott Simmons leading the discussion and sharing their perspectives on how organizations should rethink agency relationships in this new era. So with that, I'll turn things over to Tony and Scott to get us started.
Yeah, welcome everyone. So today we're talking about really the future of agency relationships. And it's interesting, Scott. I mean, it's one of those areas where people have different opinions, often strong opinions, sometimes based on a good experience or a bad experience. But it's usually bigger. It's really a bigger question than a single anecdote right now, right?
Exactly. And this is not an agency bashing session, right? Agencies still bring a lot of value. The question is whether the role we have historically asked them to play matches the way modern marketing has to operate.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because one of the reasons this is not a topic that we typically opine on, but what's happening is a number of our corporate members are coming to us with a lot of questions about this, and this has been happening for some time now. I would say a big driver of it was trying to get into this sort of omni-channel future, but then, as you can imagine, in the last year or two, the big precipitant of these conversations is AI and how AI is changing relationship. So it's really a kind of an opportune time to take a look at this.
Yeah, I mean, it's a practical tension, right? Marketing leaders want spend from agencies, but they also want enterprises to retain the data, logic, reusable assets, and learning to make the future cycles better.
Yeah, yeah. So we asked this rhetorical question, and all my good friends on the line here, you don't have to wait to the end for the answer. I'm going to give it to you right now. What is the future of agency relationships? It's really two things. First is in the near term, you're going to want to audit your agency footprint amid all this change. And the big theme, one of the big themes here is kind of reclaim the operating core, because in the world of AI, you really need to own the operating core. And we'll talk a little bit about what that is and why that is. But as a practical matter, this means over time, moving your core reusable content, customer data, decision logic, guardrails, and measurement loops really under enterprise control. And the key word there is loops. You will, in the long run, probably save money, but you'll also be much more effective in terms of transitioning your own staff and your own operation to the world of AI. But in the longer term, you still want agency partnerships. What you want to get out of them is more the creative spark, perspective, specialized skills, some creativity and wisdom here, where they're kind of inputting into the process at different points as opposed to owning the process. So that's kind of a summary of what we're saying. It is a radical transformation of for many of you, your actual agency relationship. So to the extent we're making that argument, let's talk a little bit now about how we got there. So first, we're going to sort of talk a little bit about why the old model is creaking. I think a lot of you already know that. Not going to spend a lot of time there. Then discuss what to kind of insource now. Of course, there's always been this pendulum, what to insource, outsource in the agency world. We're going to suggest that the pendulum might be switching a little bit more towards insourcing some key things here. But then along the way, we'll also note that agencies still matter. You know, agencies bring certain value here and always will. And then Scott will wrap up with how to actually, reset the supplier relationship. But with everything, always at Real Story Group, we kind of start with the stack and more generally, what's your architecture. So let's cover that first. So we have what we call the 2030 stack. There's a lot to that stack that we don't get into here. This is kind of an inside out perspective, but the general idea is that you are going to have in the future still a variety of different customer interaction contexts, probably even more than today. So that's the top level. Then what you see bounded in that kind of black oval there is your customer foundation, which is going to drive all of your future interaction, right? So you'll have shared data, content, decisioning, AI controls, guardrails, all of the operations of taking your data, which is a system of truth, your content, which is a system of meaning, and your decisioning, which is a system of direction, and putting that all together. That's a huge task, obviously, but putting it together to meet where customers are in their journey with you. And of course, in many cases, a customer is going to be presenting actually with their own agents. So that really is the core that you will need to own. Outside of that, you'll have different consultancies helping you out. You'll see those at the bottom. Systems integrators, of course, will still have a role in helping you build and integrate the various software that's required here. And you'll see agencies to the right. And the overall theme here in the architecture that we'll get into in more detail is that agencies are still bringing original ideas, some brand meetings, some source materials and media relationships. So things that they've traditionally been good at, but just that, and kind of injecting that probably in the lower levels of your stack. So we're making kind of a distinction between agencies, consultancies, and integrators here. For a smaller firm, maybe some of you get a lot of those out of the same supplier, that's fine, but these are kind of three logically different things. When we talk about agencies, we're thinking primarily around sort of creative agencies. But the key thing here is that the enterprise owns the core, and that you're going to be focusing on this core, and your partners and suppliers be feeding into this core and not necessarily doing legacy channel assignments. In other words, you won't necessarily have an email agency or a web agency or a social agency, because that world is no longer going to be with us. So that's a very big shift right there from where the architecture is really going to define a different kind of more functional agency relationship as opposed to a channel-based agency relationship. So let's move to how that then changes from what the agency model that your expectation is, right? Because as opposed to having an agency doing this kind of full cycle work for you within a particular channel, in what we call the post-channel era, your agency will not be, doing what you see on the left, which is kind of a lot of the initial high value idea stuff. That's good, but then a ton of manual production that happens in particular channels, and then specific set of client outputs where then down the road they also tell you the measurements. There's a real risk here that, first of all, the agency is going to get almost all the value that the AI automation and the production process comes, but also I think an even bigger risk there is that you have these kind of agency side black boxes and some delays in terms of the way that results get looped back into the process. So in the 2030 model, yes, the agency still helps you at the very beginning in terms of sparking ideas, maybe creating some source assets, but that your enterprise platform takes it from there. Your enterprise platform is the one that puts context and meaning and data and applies all your decisioning logic across all of your different channels, and then has automated ways of then taking the results and looping that back into better behavior. And so this whole process looks very different. And we just take one example, Scott, on the next slide is really about just talking about how this changes even from the standpoint of a brief, where a brief, which used to be a structured human document, now becomes much more of a kind of a structured interface into this whole system, where the agency is helping to create really what is the strategic objective, because a lot of what we are looking at here in terms of the future is more sort of objective-based decisioning, as opposed to sort of process and rules-based decisioning. And so this brief will look very, very different, and it's going to feed into all of your context and guardrail layers. And again, the agency will add some original concepts and some persuasion points, but the enterprise is going to own the policies, the direction, and the actual execution of this. So the handoff is less about deliverables and more about instructions and some constraints and reusable context. So this then leads us to some specific, suggestions around what will change and what will be outsourced if we look at these three pillars. The data side is probably the one where agencies will have less to add, potentially around market signals, maybe help you with some third-party data, second-party data. But for the most part, Data is something that the data layer is something that the enterprise is really going to own. That's your core system of truth. Content is where probably agencies will add the most, which is sort of brand ideas, specific assets, creative, potentially some creative variations, although again, I think a lot of that will be automated, so on and so forth. The decisioning layer, again, this is where agencies or probably more consultancies and maybe systems integrators are going to give you strategic input and optimization advice. So rather than making the decisions for you or setting up the decisioning systems, they'll just offer some wisdom about how to do this. So the key thing is that you still own these pillars. You don't want these pillars outsourced, and you don't want an agency running them, because then you lose some key assets and some key control and some key visibility and key integration in the process, which are all things really that you need to run. And in particular, because of this concept that we'll get into next, which is around the loop. So what we see at Real Story Group is sometimes some immediate benefit when an organization applies some AI-based automation to a particular process. It's often kind of a tactical benefit. The strategic value in the long run is really owning the loop, right? Where you're consistently improving the process, making the process more sophisticated, potentially more variegated for your different customers. And so you really want to own the learning loop, because in the long run, that's where the all your hard-earned lessons get accumulated into greater value for you and your customers. And so again, the agency can help here by advising you this, but what you don't want is for the agency to be owning things like attribution or the media logic or some proprietary logic in your owned and operated environment. These are all things that really need to be built into your system, because you're going to go customer first as opposed to channel first. So you can get some input in terms of good practices, but you don't want to outsource the loop. And to the extent that where the value is in the loop, that's something that you want to make sure with your data science team and within your broader architecture that you're building yourself. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Scott to sort of take us into the second half of the discussion here, a little bit longer than second half. I'll just remind folks that you'll all be getting copies of this deck. And those of you who are Real Story Group subscribers, you'll get a link in the next 1 or 2 days to an actual video recording of this. The other thing is that already I may have raised some things that maybe make you want to ask questions. You can use the questions service in the GoToWebinar control panel. That's at the top. You'll see a little square with like a question mark inside of it. It's a speech bubble with a question mark. Just click there. Feel free to add a question. We'll have time at the end to get to your questions. But Scott, tell us a little bit more. And this is where we're going to get a little bit more practical about what are the capabilities to bring inside your organization from what we might be doing with an agency today.
Thanks, Tony. So this is where the conversation stops being theoretical, because once organizations start building AI-enabled operating environments, they quickly realize that someone must own the foundations of that environment. And increasingly, that foundation is not the campaign, it's not the channel, it's the data, content, and decisioning. So this is really the core architectural idea underneath the whole presentation. So we think the modern marketing operating models increasingly organize around 3 enterprise-owned layers: data, content, and decisioning. Not channels, not campaigns, and not applications. So these become the foundational systems that AI and automation operate against. Data becomes the system of truth, content becomes the system of meaning, and decisioning becomes the system of direction. Now, importantly, we are not saying agencies disappear from this picture, but ownership changes. In data, the enterprise owns the customer record, consent, identity, KPI definition, governance, and the raw event signals. Agencies contribute marketing intelligence, campaign context, and external signals. In content, the enterprise increasingly owns reusable components, rights metadata, approved claims, structured messaging, and brand governance. And agencies contribute distinctive concepts that creative spark, right? The cultural interpretation for local markets, and the source assets that you might use to generate your components. And on the decisioning side, enterprises increasingly own the optimization layer itself, right? The loop, the weights, the guardrails, the test logic, and the decision logs. Agencies still contribute strategy and optimization advice here, but the learning loop increasingly moves inside the enterprise. And that matters enormously because the systems that own the learning loop accumulate the advantage over time. So this is another major transition we're seeing. In the earlier model, paid media, owned channels, email, social, influencer programs, all operated semi-independently. They often had different agencies, different KPIs, different reporting structures, and different optimization systems. And agencies frequently mirrored that fragmentation. But AI systems fundamentally prefer shared context on all of this. So in the emerging model, shared content, shared data, and shared decisioning and unified optimization loops become dramatically more valuable because AI compounds learning across systems. And that's why ownership conversations become strategic, not just operational. The agency may still buy media, but the enterprise should increasingly own the signals, assets, optimization logic, and measurement foundation underneath it. So up to this point, we've mostly been talking about operating model and ownership structures. The big idea in the enterprises increasingly need to own the foundational learning layers, like that data, content, and decisioning governance. But once organizations accept that direction, the next question becomes, what changes operationally? What changes in the agency relationship, in the contracts, in the governance, in the workflow? And that's really the next section is about, because the future model is not just a different org structure, it's different economics and operational relationships between the enterprise and the external partners. So this is one of the most practical changes enterprises can start making immediately. So traditional agency relationships are usually governed through an SOW by output metrics, right? Number of assets, number of campaigns, number of reports, number of deliverables. But AI destabilizes the economics behind those units. So increasingly, we think relationships shift towards operational outcomes or service level objectives. Reusable asset rates, learning velocity, cycle time reduction, optimization improvements, measurement quality. In other words, less focus on volume, more focus on improving the system itself. That's a very different commercial relationship. And frankly, many existing agency contracts are not structured for the future yet.
Yeah, and Scott, I think we see in the press that some agency leaders are kind of talking a good game around this, which is productive. I think the executives are kind of understanding this. I think where the rubber really meets the road is you being able to specifically drive this transformation yourself and change these relationships with your specific agency. Even if their holding company has good thinking around this, it doesn't mean that your agency always does.
Right. So one way to kind of look at this is, through a scorecard, right? So this is a framework we use when thinking about agency activities, right? The question is not agency or no agency. The question is which work belongs where, right? So the top left, some activities are strategically differentiating and should stay very close, right? Brand platforms, creative differentiation, cultural intelligence. On the top right, there's the category where co-creation makes sense initially, but enterprises may eventually internalize the capability, right? So journey logic, AI experimentation, measurement systems. Some things increasingly commoditize, right? That's the bottom left. Routine reporting, basic trafficking, simple renditions. These are becoming heavily automated. And bottom right, this is the dangerous category. So high dependency and low strategic uniqueness. Opaque media logic, black box optimization, proprietary AI operations, and agency-owned data. That's where we increasingly advise clients to reconsider relationships very carefully. So the agency audit, when clients ask us where to start, we usually tell them, don't start with procurement, start with your architecture and do discovery around that. Find where actual dependencies sit, who owns the data, the prompts, the optimization logic, the experimentation history, the reusable assets, the measurement definitions, because many organizations discover that they've outsourced far more operational intelligence than they've realized. And often those dependencies are hidden inside process, not technology. So this becomes an organizational and governance exercise as much as a vendor exercise. This is another area that becomes extremely important very quickly. Once agencies start using AI systems operationally, enterprises need much clearer governance around rights, provenance, privacy, model access, logging, human review. These are not just procurement concerns anymore. They're increasingly becoming operational architecture concerns.
Yeah, it's so interesting, Scott, because we already, a couple of our corporate members have talked to us about how, they have some concerns about the AI-driven derivatives and renditions that are coming out of from their agency, clients. It's not just like the hand with six fingers and other sorts of hallucinations. There are other sometimes rights or guardrail or privacy issues that come up, ownership issues. That are complicated. So you can't just like outsource the whole problem to the agency, because to some extent that even makes this all even more opaque, and you're less responsible in the way that you're doing it.
Yeah. I think this side kind of just sums it up, right? So this is a simple summary of the shift, right? We are not advocating replacing agencies. In fact, we think the best agencies probably become even more valuable in the future. But the division of labor changes, right? The enterprise increasingly owns the learning loop, the governance layer, the foundation, the reusable context, and the agencies, provide that creative spark, the specialized expertise, the marketing intelligence, right? So the enterprise buys the wisdom, not just rent. We don't just rent production capacity from the agency anymore.
That's so important, Scott. I think the point you're making there is that agencies don't go away. The things that you really relied on for agencies, you still want to lean on even maybe more heavily than ever in the AI world. Having said that, probably your overall spend with your agencies is likely in most cases to go down, because maybe not as much as you might like, but you're really going to be relying on their most creative talent. And much less, production work, and they'll be a little bit more advisor and inputter rather than actual a producer of your marketing campaigns and other work. And so our thesis here is that you can recycle some of those funds to build up some of the internal capacity you're going to need around AI-based experience generation. So some of you are probably asking, this sounds great, Scott. How do I get there? This is a pretty heady change, and I'm going to suggest that Real Story Group, we're in a really great position to help you through this. We're working with some of our clients now on these very issues. As you know, we are not tied to any particular integrator, agency, and certainly no software vendors. We evaluate software vendors certainly for a living. So we're not going to give you any kind of quadrant here. We're going to we sit only on your side of the table, which means we're only interested in your success, both as an enterprise and also for you as a MarTech leader, that you're successful in meeting this really complicated but exciting new world. So with that, why don't we kind of wrap up here just with a quick action plan. As Scott mentioned, you'll want to classify your current agency work in the 4 buckets that he lays out here. Move your core assets, what we say, south in your stack. So we often call that Pilates for your stack. We've been arguing that for some time now and seeing some organizations do this successfully to meet the omnichannel world. Then you can begin to reset some contracts and some interfaces with your firms, again, kind of realigning your spend along the way, and then ultimately start piloting a new agency model. And you can do that with a particular branch, a particular process, a particular channel. There's a variety of ways to do this. We're seeing some enterprises kind of feel their way now. So happy to help you out along that journey as you go forward. And with that, I just want to remind everyone, if you have any questions or comments or concerns or anything you disagree with, feel free to use the questions box. That's the little speech bubble at the top of your interface with the question mark in it, to ask us any question at all, and we'll have time for that. In the meantime, I'll turn it over to my colleague Scott Dill to talk about next steps.
Yeah, great. Thanks, guys. Really appreciated the content. It was excellent conversation. And we'll be continuing the conversation on June 10th, our next webinar, which will be about strategic lessons for MarTech leaders. We've been supporting MarTech organizations for over 20 years now. And so we're happy to bring that experience to bear to share some important lessons with you. And speaking of MarTech leaders, our Stack Leadership Council continues to meet quarterly. We have our next session coming up on June 17th, where we focused on MarTech org models. So if that's something you'd like to explore and expand your network with your MarTech peers, but also gain support from RSG in terms of your stack or advisory decisions, drop us a line and be happy to walk you through a little bit more about that council. With that, I'll turn things over to you guys again for any questions that have come in.
Yeah, so Scott Simmons, already some interesting questions have come in. One is, our CMO is a big believer in outsourcing to agencies. The problem is that our agency sometimes refuses to share all the content and the prompts and the process by which they go through with us, including how they build metrics. So what do we do about that?
Yeah, I mean that can be common. A lot of agencies treat some of that as proprietary information to begin with, but it is a risk signal. But it doesn't mean you need to move away from that relationship immediately. What you should look at is, as you come up on your next contract cycle, you should require transparency, exportability, and logs to be sure you're getting what you need.
Yeah, and increasingly getting the raw data so that you can do your own metrics, which in many cases you may be able to do faster if you have the resources, and to certainly react to it faster than the stuff you're getting from your agency. Here's another one. Our agency, or our enterprise, relies very much on an external media agency for all of our paid media work. How do you see that? What should we do about that in the future?
They still fit, right? I mean, they have the buying power, right? The channel expertise, the marketing intelligence, but the enterprise should continue to own kind of the cross-channel signal layer and the logic that connects media to the customer experience, so that you can power personalization and everything else that you're doing from an AI perspective with that data.
Yeah, it's so important because we think that this notion of paid media as its own really standalone business channel is going to change, not the least because of all the changes that are happening now in paid media, but also with the rise of customer agents who are going to turn off a lot of ads by default, or at least filter them quite substantially, that you're really going to finally need to integrate your paid and owned and operated in a much more holistic way than you've been doing before. And you got into that a little bit earlier. And I think we're going to have to, that's one, along with email and web, that's really ripe for kind of de-siloization. So I think just the whole notion of just a paid media agency, that's likely to go away among savvy enterprises. Okay, last question. We're having a debate in our company about how much work we should bring, how much AI work we should bring in-house. I say we should do almost all of it. My boss thinks it's better to outsource. What do you think?
It's a mix, right? So use specialists, right? This world is changing too fast to expect your in-house group to have all the expertise. But the key is that enterprise policies, context rights, decision logs, and learning stay under enterprise control, right? But don't be afraid to bring in the specialists to help you out.
Great. So with that, we're wrapping up right on time. Want to thank you all again for joining us. It's always a pleasure to spend time with you. Feel free to reach out with any other questions or comments you have at the coordinates that you see on the screen. In the meantime, this is Tony Byrne signing off for our two excellent RSG Scott colleagues here, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye now.
Thanks.